So, what do you see when you see the sea? As you walk out to the coastal areas on the beach and you look out upon the waters, what exactly is it that you see? What is it you are looking for? Do you ever find it? All these questions, of course, are very important. And for any of those who happen to wander around out there, I know some of you are just out for a little sun and maybe a little dip in the water, but there is much more to the sea than that, and any sailor can easily confirm that for you because there's just nothing else like being there. I like to begin this with a certain introduction given by a folklorist named Horace Beck, and this is out of his book called Folklore and the Sea. This particular thing, I think, really conveys what it is and what it means to be out at the sea, to make your living on the sea, and how you interact with other people on the sea. So here it goes. For folklore to survive and flourish, it requires a very special climate. It feeds on isolation, illiteracy, and tradition. Tradition stretching backward into the dimmest, most musty corners of antiquity. It is bred in unknowing and in violence. It survives because in some way it is functional. Environment plays a large part in its creation, shaping, and preserving. Few areas of the world are better suited to the preservation and creation of folklore than the sea. Since before the dawn of history, man has been a voyager. He has traveled along the coast, fished in the estuaries and bays, been driven offshore in some gales and onshore in others. Some men have sunk, and some have burned, and some have won home to end their days on the beach dreaming of the other days. Others, still before the dawn of history, have fared forth over the edge of the world to the place where the sun set in the seething waters. Some came back, some drowned, and a few found haven in new strange lands. Those who returned told stories about their adventures, and those who came home no more themselves became topics of speculation and of stories. Yet man is never at home completely on the sea. Even the most hardy and dedicated sailor has his qualms about his occupation at times. And although some, like Moby Dick's Bulkington, are easy only in deep water, it is because they are forced there by dangers ashore that present even greater hazards. Because man is not indigenous to the sea, neither is folklore entirely indigenous. Rather, the majority of this material comes from the land and is adjusted to fit the aquatic climate. That which is native to the sea has been created after the manner of terrestrial lore. In brief, the folklore of the sea is the flotsam and jetsam of folklore from many lands, from many peoples over many centuries, that has been immersed in the brine of the ocean and has become a product of difference from original, as in the resin that is soaked in seawater and becomes amber. I feel that this is a very good introduction into the study of folklore and the sea, and as it especially relates to the topic that I'm going to go into here. One of the main things that really caught my eye about the sea and maritime culture, maritime stories, maritime folklore, whether it be songs, stories, or jokes, or different things that people happen to have heard about the sea from other people, it's really interesting how a lot of things are quite similar and how some are quite different. But one of the big themes that a lot of people do talk about and are fascinated with is folklore with ghosts and the sea. The first thing I'm going to be talking about as far as it goes with ghosts, folklore, and the sea is involving a story that many people are familiar with. And then I'm going to talk about another story that deals with other things that people are not as familiar with, because it's a story that some people know because it also involves a folk song that has many different versions And I think I found as many as 11 of them that I talked about in a paper that I wrote. But to begin with, I'm going to talk about a story that is rather famous, even if it has several different versions. And then I will move from that on to the other story that I did a lot of research into. So to begin with, I thought I'd give a little bit of background with me and getting into this particular area of research. So when I came to Utah State University to study folklore, I had several ideas on things that I wish to emphasize. I originally thought that I would be studying something along the great Celtic stories of the British Isles. Those stories have always fascinated me, after all. And having visited Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, mostly Wales, of course, I noticed the beautiful scenery, the land, and it was really something that stood out and kind of changed my outlook in my life on many things. Suddenly, all of those stories of the heroes and fairies of the land, they all came to life to me. I wanted to truly understand it all about the land that I was walking on with all of its ancient artifacts, its relics and structures. Who wouldn't be enthralled by all of these things that I was seeing around me, after all? Any of you who are not indigenous to the British Isles but have been there can probably relate to that particular sentiment. But upon my first appearing at Utah State campus, something else came to me. So among the first classes that one takes when studying folklore at Utah State University, you first have to pick a topic for your final project in order to move forward. At the time, I'd already botched some work related to the British Isles, as it related to a quasi-historical figure named Vortigern, whom many of you have heard of, and so I won't go into him right now because he's not important. And that failure kind of hurt my ego. I decided that perhaps just to get some practice, I'd pick a maritime subject, maritime history and culture, especially the stories that sailors tell about their voyages, was a close second where it came to the subject of folklore that really interested me. I decided that I would find some of those stories and work with that in order to create my outline. Then later I could gear it back to the British Isles and create a plan with that in mind. I soon decided that what I'd do was find all the stories that I could that dealt with ghost ships. Who doesn't love a good ghost story, after all, right? There are several such stories to be found if one knows really where to look. Some of them are better known than others. One of the best well-known ones, of course, has to do with the Flying Dutchman. So if one goes back to the old traditions, the Flying Dutchman isn't actually a ship, but it is a designation of a captain known as Heinrich van der Decken. According to most stories, that's his name, who had committed some kind of sacrilege that doomed him to sail the seas until Judgment Day. As he was trying to round the Cape of Good Hope and encountered a storm, one story says that because of his cursing of God, who warned him to turn back, he was condemned to never cross the Cape of Good Hope, to forever be sailing stormy seas. It is a phantom ship, and disaster follows to any of those who happen upon that particular ship. But in the future, later on, of course, it has been designated as the name of a ship itself, but that isn't what the original designation of Flying Dutchman meant. There are several stories to have come down to us from those who claim to have encountered it, usually on a dark and stormy night, as ghostly vessels on the edge of one's vision. Then others claim that it has come out next to the vessel, where it would appear for a time and then vanish into thin air. One such encounter is written in a journal of a man who'd eventually become King George V of Great Britain. And so on July 11th in 1881, this prince witnessed the appearance of the Flying Dutchman. The story takes place, of course, off the coast of Australia instead of Africa. As it comes to the Flying Dutchman, there are, of course, several accounts that people have given about seeing it. One of the most famous ones was an event that happened on July 11th in 1881, where Prince George, who would later become King George V of Great Britain, he was sailing from Melbourne, Australia to Sydney, and they had an event. He was sailing on a ship called the Bachante, I think is how you pronounce that, or Bachante. I'll have to have someone explain that to me once. And this is the account that he gives. July 11th, at 4 a.m., the Flying Dutchman crossed our bows. A strange red light as of the phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the mast, spars, and sails of the brig 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief as she came up on the port bow. The lookout man on the forecastle reported her as close on the port bow, where also the officer of the watch from the bridge clearly saw her, as did also the quarter-deck midshipman, who was sent forward at once to the forecastle. But on arriving there, no vestige nor any sign whatsoever of any material ship was to be seen, either near or right away to the horizon. The night being clear as the sea calm, 13 persons altogether saw her, but whether it was Van Diemen or the Flying Dutchman or who else must remain unknown. The Tourmaline and Cleopatra, who were sailing on our starboard bow, flashed to ask whether we had seen the strange red light. At 6:15 a.m., observed land Mount Diana to the northeast. At 10:45 a.m., the ordinary seaman who had this morning reported the Flying Dutchman fell from the foretopmast cross trees on the top-gallant forecastle and was smashed to atoms. At 4:15 p.m., after quarters, we hove to with the head yards aback, and he was buried in the sea. He was a smart royal yardman and one of the most promising young hands in the ship, and everyone feels great sadness at his loss. At the next port we came to, the admiral also was smitten down. Judging by this account, some people might think that this was an idea that popped into his head about the Flying Dutchman after they got to port because such tragic things happened. And one of the stories or one of the legends about the Flying Dutchman is those who see the ship or come too close to it will not live to see a very long life, or they will have some kind of tragedy. Take that as you will, but this is what Prince George said about the Flying Dutchman and his encounter with it. But the Flying Dutchman, with its many accounts, though interesting, I feel that it's a story that has been done to death, and I didn't feel that I could add a lot to it with my own work. It would likely require me to contact people in Cape Town and other places to really get the best information. So I took a different track. I decided that I would pick a different maritime ghost story, the story of the schooner the Charles Haskell. I'm guessing that most people not doing a deep dive into maritime ghost stories wouldn't likely come across this particular story. What I feel made it most interesting is that it was a ghost story that was also put to song. And when you put stories to song, of course, it has their own effects, but all the versions of the story go something like this. Sailing out of the port of Boston in 1866, a schooner by the name of the Charles Haskell, or just the Haskell according to some accounts, headed north to the fertile fishing grounds of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Due to the coming stormy weather, the ship sought shelter in an area of several other ships to ride out the storm. The spot chosen is known as George's Bank. The storm was so terrible that many of the ships anchored at George's Bank suffered, but none suffered more than that of the Andrew Johnston or Andrew Jackson, depending on who you ask. On that evening, during the storm, that chain anchoring the Charles Haskell snapped, causing it to barrel down on the Johnston, smashing into its side, slicing it into two before it sank to the bottom. There were no survivors of this particular ship. It's a tragedy at sea, So many tragedies of ships sinking below the waves can be found in the logs and oral traditions of sailors worldwide. What makes this one different is what happened the next time the Charles Haskell happened to sail through George's Bank. This time at George's Bank, the Charles Haskell didn't encounter a storm. On the Grand Dog watch, a kind of chilling feeling came over the crew. Something wasn't quite right. Then, the sound of a voice calling from the sea could be heard. Out of the water rose 26 ghostly sailors, who quickly climbed aboard the ship. Stunned, the crew of the Haskell watched as each ghost took upon himself the control of a portion of the ship. The wheel, the rigging, the sail, and the nets moved and responded to the commands that the invading spirits gave. Then another shock came, for these were the same sailors that had manned the Andrew Johnston that the Haskell had sank the year before. Oblivious to the living crew, the ghostly sailors took the ship through the waters in and around George's Bank, through the darkness where the living could barely see. It wasn't known to all the living just how long this took place, but coming around a bend on the coast, a light came into view. It was that of the lighthouse in the distance. Some say it was Cape Pogue Light, while others say that it was Thatchet Island. Regardless, at the sight of it, the ghostly crew stopped what they were doing, and, one by one, returned to the sea from which they came. When the ship returned to port, the story was told to many in the taverns of New England and the Maritime provinces. From then on, every time the Charles Haskell sailed through the waters of George's Bank, the ghosts would appear again to go through the same process before returning again to the sea. As this happened too many times, no one would ever agree to sail on that ship again, so the ship was left to rot off the coast near Halifax in Nova Scotia. So that, in a sense, is the story of the ghostly crew who came aboard the ship and took control during the time that the song talks about. There are, of course, other ghost stories, maritime ghost stories, things that come out of the sea and fly around. There are ghost ship stories like, other than the Charles Haskell and the Flying Dutchman, you also have the Queen Mary, the Mary Celeste. You also have the Teaser and many others that have left their ghostly mark behind as they sail around the world to the people who encounter them and do not know what to think about the encounter. But I'm going to end there with this particular story because this is basically what I wanted to talk about. In the future, I am going to be telling other stories for people to hear, and at that time, I will be doing a better job, I am pretty sure, because as I practice each of my new experiments into storytelling, I am working hard to push it so that it does not sound like I am necessarily reading something all the time, or so it doesn't sound like I'm blabbing around trying to think of the right words to say. But stay tuned and wait till next time when I have the story to tell, for there are so many interesting stories that one can find intriguing, or that can uplift the soul, or that can chill one to the bone. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Until next time, I bid thee adieu.